In the sweeping, sun-scorched expanse of the North African theatre during the pivotal months of 1943, the machinery of war was dictated not just by the caliber of artillery or the thickness of tank armor, but by the relentless logistics of supply. The war in the desert was a war of roads, of long, dusty ribbons of asphalt and hard-pan tracks stretching across Tunisia and Morocco, serving as the arteries that kept the heart of the Axis war machine beating. Along these exposed routes, convoys of trucks moved, fuel, ammunition, and men to the front lines, supporting General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in their desperate bid to hold the continent. The Allies faced a tactical conundrum that conventional warfare struggled to solve. While air superiority allowed for strafing runs and heavy bombers could target depots, the sheer ubiquity of the road network meant that interdicting enemy supplies was a game of impossible scale. Sabotage was the obvious answer, but the traditional methods of the saboteur destroying bridges or mining. Railways required penetrating heavily guarded perimeters where sentries and patrols were on constant alert to disrupt the flow of supplies without engaging in suicidal assaults on fortified positions. Allied intelligence needed a weapon that could be deployed in the open, under the very noses of the enemy. A weapon so mundane and so ubiquitous that it would vanish into the landscape the moment it was placed. The solution they arrived at was perhaps the most bizarre and creative example of asymmetrical warfare in the 20th century, a high-explosive device, meticulously disguised as animal excrement. The architect of this unconventional strategy was Carlton S. Kuhn, a man who fit no standard profile of a military commando. Kuhn was a distinguished anthropologist from Harvard University, a scholar of human culture and history who had traded the lecture hall for the dusty, dangerous reality of fieldwork in war zones. Serving as an operative for the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, Kuhn brought an academic's eye for detail and a cultural understanding of the local environment that professional soldiers often lacked. He was leading a ragged band of approximately 50 irregulars, a mix of Americans, Frenchmen, and local Arab guerrillas through territory that was effectively controlled by German and Italian forces. His mandate was chaos, his method was sabotage, but his resources were limited. Kuhn understood that in the desert, camouflage was not just about painting a truck green or wearing khaki. It was about blending into the biological rhythm of the land. He observed that while military vehicles were foreign intrusions on the North African landscape, animals were an eternal constant. Camels, donkeys, mules, and goats wandered the roads freely, and their droppings were the one feature of the terrain that every driver, soldier, and sentry ignored completely. To the military mind, focused on detecting mines, tripwires, and ambushes, a pile of mule dung on the road was simply a fact of life, an object of disgust perhaps, but certainly not a threat. Kuhn realized that if he could weaponize this blind spot, he could turn every mile of road in Tunisia into a potential kill zone. To realize this vision, Kuhn engaged in a logistical operation that bordered on the surreal. Before any explosives could be manufactured, he needed to understand the camouflage perfectly. He began collecting authentic samples of mule and camel droppings from the Moroccan roadsides, treating them with the same scientific rigor he would have applied to an archaeological artifact. These biological samples were packaged and sent via British diplomatic pouch to London, a journey that surely baffled any courier aware of the contents. Kuhn later remarked on the absurdity of utilizing the highest levels of diplomatic transit to ship animal waste across a continent at war. But the specificity was necessary. The British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, which was tasked with setting Europe ablaze through subversion and sabotage, understood that a counterfeit object had to be perfect. If a German soldier stopped to inspect a suspicious object on the road, it had to pass scrutiny, not just visually, but technically. The samples sent by Kuhn served as the master templates for a production line that would blend the lethal science of high explosives with the delicate artistry of the film industry. The manufacture of these devices took place in the quiet, leafy countryside of Hertfordshire, at a requisitioned country house hotel known as the Thatched Barn, designated as Station 15 by the Soviets. This facility was the heart of the British camouflage section. It was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel J. Elder Wills, a man whose background was as eclectic as the weapons he produced. A veteran of the Royal Air Force in the First World War, Wills had spent the interwar years working in the British film industry as an art director. He understood the visual language of deception, the way light hit a surface. and the importance of texture in creating a believable illusion. When the Second World War broke out, Wills did not recruit chemists or engineers to staff Station 15. He recruited his colleagues from the nearby Elstree studios. The team comprised plasterers, prop makers, set designers, and stage technicians, men who had spent their careers building fantasy worlds for the cinema and were now tasked with building weapons of war. Among them was Walter Bull, a master plasterer who would survive the war to become the chief plasterer on Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, creating the moonscapes and alien monoliths of the future. But in 1943, his medium was not starships, but dung. These craftsmen were uniquely suited to the task because they approached the problem not as a scientific equation, but as an artistic challenge. A scientist might design a bomb that exploded efficiently. An artist ensured the bomb looked like something that had just fallen out of a mule. The process, developed at Station 15 and its substation at the Natural History Museum in London, was a triumph of practical effects. The craftsmen made molds from the real samples Kuhn and others had provided, capturing every undulation, fiber, and imperfection of the original droppings. They realized quickly that there was no singular dung. A camel's diet produced a different texture than a mule's. A fresh dropping looked different from one that had baked in the sun for 3 hours. To account for this, the sew produced variations for different theaters of operation. There were camel dung bombs for the deep desert, mule and donkey variants for the Mediterranean, littoral and mountain passes, and even cowpat mines, designed for use by the resistance in the pastures of rural France. The outer casing was made of a painted plastic or resin skin, meticulously colored to match the local faner's diet. Inside this repulsive shell lay the charge, Nobel 808. This was the standard British plastic explosive of the era, a malleable green dough-like substance that smelled faintly of almonds. It was stable, powerful, and easily molded to fit irregular shapes. The genius of the device, however, lay in its trigger mechanism. The SO engineers designed a pressure switch that was sensitive enough to detonate under the weight of a vehicle tire, but robust enough to withstand being dropped or stepped on by a human or animal. The goal was to disable the vehicle, shredding the tires and potentially rupturing the fuel tank or killing the occupants, while leaving the innocent donkey that might step on it unharmed. The psychological dimension of this weapon was as potent as the explosive itself. The SO and OS understood that the primary objective of sabotage is not merely the destruction of assets, but the erosion of the enemy's sense of security. When a soldier fears that a discarded tin of fruit, a lump of coal, or a pile of manure might kill him, his efficiency. The dung bomb was part of a wider family of booby traps developed by the British, which included the infamous explosive coal-fake lumps of anthracite painted to look like fuel, designed to be shoveled into the boilers of locomotives or steamships, causing catastrophic explosions from within. While the coal was highly effective, it required agents to infiltrate fuel dumps. The dung bomb, by contrast, required no infiltration. It could be dropped from a hole in a trouser leg, tossed from a passing bicycle, or placed by a shepherd moving his flock across a road. It turned the entire environment into a weapon. The mere existence of such devices forced the enemy to treat the mundane world with suspicion. German security forces were compelled to waste thousands of man-hours inspecting debris, slowing down convoys and exhausting troops who were already stretched to the breaking point by the harsh desert conditions. Carlton Kuhn's deployment of these devices in Tunisia is the most well-documented instance of their use. In his memoir, A North Africa Story, he recounts the operation with a mixture of pride and dark humor. He described the weapon as the mule's revenge on the motor vehicle, a phrase that captures the essence of the low-tech, striking back against the mechanized. Kuhn's team, operating deep behind enemy lines, would scatter the devices on roads known to be used by Axis supply trucks. The operational reality, however, was often less dramatic than the concept. Kuhn admitted that the confirmed kills attributed to the dung bombs were statistically negligible. He famously cited the casualties as 1 Arab civilian and 1 cow. There is a lack of concrete evidence in German after-action reports detailing massive losses of transport to exploding excrement. Yet, to judge the weapon solely by the number of destroyed trucks is to misunderstand its purpose. The weapon was a disruptor. It was an agent of chaos designed to make the occupation of North Africa more difficult, more dangerous, and more frustrating for the Axis powers. A persistent legend surrounding the campaign suggests a fascinating game of cat and mouse regarding the dung bombs. The story, often repeated in military trivia but lacking primary documentation, claims that German tank drivers initially believed driving over camel dung was good luck. When the Allies learned of this superstition, they began planting the bombs, turning the luck ritual deadly. The legend goes on to say that the Germans, realizing the ruse, began avoiding fresh dung but would still drive over dung that showed tire marks, reasoning that if it had already been run over, it must be safe. In response, the British allegedly began manufacturing fake dung with tire tracks already molded into it. While this narrative is compelling and illustrates the escalating nature of countermeasures in war, it likely falls into the category of war stories, myths that arise to explain the ingenuity and cruelty of conflict. No German manuals or diaries have been found to corroborate the lucky dung superstition or the specific counterattack. However, the fact that such a story exists speaks to the psychological impact of the weapon. It represents the idea that in total war, nothing is sacred and nothing is safe. The broader context of the dung bomb program highlights the stark difference in resources between the Allies and the Axis. By 1943, the American industrial machine was fully engaged, and the British, though battered, were leveraging their scientific and creative communities to the fullest. The Germans, conversely, were fighting a war of scarcity. Rommel's defeat in North Africa was ultimately a defeat of logistics. He ran out of fuel, he ran out of tanks, and he ran out of time. The Allied ability to devote resources to creating artisanal, explosive poop stands in sharp contrast to a German army that was struggling to keep its tanks fueled. The Germans did have their own sabotage devices, including explosive chocolate bars and tinned food, but the sheer variety and creativity of the British toys, as they were called in Alexandria, demonstrated a flexibility of thought that defined the SO. They were willing to be ridiculous if it meant being effective. They were willing to employ plasterers and anthropologists alongside generals and engineers. This interdisciplinary approach, breaking down the silos between the arts, sciences, and military, allowed for innovations that a strictly regimented military hierarchy might have rejected out of hand. The craftsmanship involved in these devices garnered attention from the highest levels of the British government. Winston Churchill and King George VI both visited the secret display rooms at the Natural History Museum to inspect the fruits of Station 15's labor. One can imagine the Prime Minister, a man known for his appreciation of unconventional warfare, examining a plaster cast of camel dung with the same gravity he applied to maps of the invasion of Europe. These visits underscore that the dirty tricks department was not a rogue operation but a sanctioned and valued component of the national strategy. The government recognized that in a war for national survival, propriety was a luxury they could not afford. If disguising a bomb as animal waste could save a British life or delay a German column by an hour, it was a tactic worth pursuing. The memorial plaque that stands today outside the Mammals Gallery of the Natural History Museum is a quiet testament to this strange chapter of history, honoring the men and women who worked in secret to turn nature, study into weapon design. The legacy of the dung bomb extends far beyond the deserts of North Africa. It established a precedent for the use of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, disguised as trash or debris, a tactic that has become the hallmark of modern insurgency warfare. In the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later, coalition forces faced threats hidden in styrofoam blocks, dead animals, and roadside trash, echoing the fears instilled by Carlton Coone's guerrillas. The psychological mechanism remains identical. By weaponizing the environment, the insurgent forces the occupying army to view the entire world as hostile. The profound anxiety generated by the possibility that a pile of rubbish could be lethal creates a cognitive load on soldiers that degrades their performance and morale. The SOE's experiments in World War II were the ancestors of these modern asymmetric tactics. They proved that you do not need a tank to destroy a tank. You only need a bit of plastic explosive, a lot of creativity, and a deep understanding of human psychology. While the exploding rat remains the most famous of the SOE's unused devices, having been intercepted by the Germans before it could be deployed, leading to a massive waste of German resources searching for rats that didn't exist. The dung bomb actually saw the field. It was carried in the hands of brave men, hidden in the sacks of shepherds, and placed on the hard, unforgiving roads of Tunisia. It represents the intersection of the sublime and the ridiculous, a weapon born of desperation and ingenuity. The image of a Harvard professor, coordinating with Hollywood set designers to ship fake mule droppings across the Mediterranean, encapsulates the total mobilization of World War II. Was a war where everyone's skills were repurposed for violence. The plasterer who could make a fake rock look real for a camera was suddenly essential to the war effort. The anthropologist who knew the migration patterns of nomads became a tactical asset. Ultimately, the story of the dung bomb is a story about the definition of a weapon. We tend to think of weapons as sleek, metallic, industrial objects, missiles, jets, but the most dangerous weapon is often the one that looks the least like a threat. The British and Americans proved that with enough imagination, the most repulsive and ignored substance on Earth could be transformed into a tool of war. They took the basest material excrement and elevated it to a strategic asset. The confirmed physical damage caused by these devices may have been minimal, a few blown tires and a terrified cow, but the conceptual damage was significant. It signaled to the Axis forces that there was no limit to what the Allies would do, no depth to which they would not stoop, and no object that was safe to touch. In the grinding attrition of the North African campaign, where victory was measured in the accumulation of small advantages, the ability to make a German truck driver sweat every time he saw a pile of manure on the road was a victory in itself. It was a triumph of the mind over the machine, proving that in war, a clever idea can be just as dangerous as a heavy gun. The dung bomb remains a symbol of British eccentricity weaponized, a reminder that when survival is at stake, dignity is the first casualty. And anything, absolutely anything, can be a trap.